When it comes to smocking or pleat work embroidery, not only are there many ways to pleat your fabric, there are even more ways to mark your fabric for pleating. Have you ever wondered if one way is better than the other? Well, you're in luck, because in today's video we explore the different ways of pleating and the pros and cons of each. You know, Mullen and I have spent a lot of time gathering fabric for smocking, and between the two of us we probably have about a couple decades worth of experience. You know, we've both made a lot of mistakes along the way. We've had to figure out ways to fix those mistakes. So we put our heads together, and in today's video, we are going to go over the different methods for marking your fabric for pleating, the different methods for pleating by hand, and as a bonus, we're even going to throw in best practices for using a smocking pleater. Hello friend, I'm Elena with Thimble and Plume, and we are historical costumers, and we love sharing the things that we have learned over the years in order to empower you to become the best costumer you can be. Smocking is a decorative needlework technique which gathers a length of fabric into even folds and secures them with stitching. The stitching can either be hidden within or under the folds, or it can draw attention to itself with decorative designs. Additional embellishment can be applied atop the pleats in the form of embroidery or applied trims. Today, the term smocking often brings to mind christening gowns or little girl dresses, but the technique shows up as early as the 12th century. In order to avoid confusion, it has become popular to refer to the technique as pleatwork embroidery when referring to the smocking that we see in the medieval and early modern periods. In the first third of the 16th century, shirts with pleatwork embroidery and shirring were popular in Germany and Italy. First step in smocking or pleatwork embroidery is making your pleats or gathers. Now you can either mark where these stitches are going to go, or you can do it by eye. So when you're pleating by eye, basically what you're doing is you're counting the threads and you are placing the needle at even intervals throughout the length of the fabric. And then you have to move down to the next row and make sure that row is evenly spaced away from that first row, as well as all those stitches matching up with the previous row. I gotta hand it to Mullen because I've never personally been able to master this technique. As a matter of fact, it actually kind of stresses me out because I find that my eyes kind of can't keep track of the count, and then I'll go back and redo it over and over again, and it just takes me too long and I stress out about it. Whereas Mullen says it actually is something that she finds relaxing to do. And I think it's important to note that not all techniques will work for you. Some you may love and some you may hate. So if you have one that doesn't work for you, try another one. So if you're like me, you'll need to mark the pleats before you begin. And you can either do this by hand or you can use iron-on smocking dots. For marking by hand, you can use a pencil, chalk, or disappearing ink. Or you can make small pricks with an awl. Now, we don't know if or how they marked the pleats in the 16th century, but it is plausible that they could have used an awl or a prick and pounce method as was used in embroidery. But since we do know that the women that made these smocks of the 18th and 19th century stitched the pleats by eye, odds are they did the same in the 16th century. You'll also need a way to make sure that you're placing the marks at even intervals along your fabric. And you can do this using a ruler. Simply lay your ruler on your fabric and begin marking across the fabric at your chosen interval with the marking implement of your choice. Now, Mullen is using a water-soluble marker, but you can use a pencil or any other sort of fabric marking implement that you choose. Another option is to make a template from cardboard, cardstock, or vellum. Simply place the ruler over your chosen template material and poke holes using a tapestry needle, awl, or other sharp and skinny implement. Then you can either mark the holes with a pencil or fabric marker, or you can use the pounce method seen here. You can also use a piece of plastic canvas cut down to size and then mark the holes you wish to use with a marker. Then you just mark through the holes with your favorite marking implement. If you are marking your dots by hand, you'll need to know how far to space them apart. Now, in my experience, you want them to be fairly close together, but it does depend on the look you are going for. The finest, more richly pleated embroidery packs a lot of pleats into a small area. If you go for a deeper pleat, it tends to have a more crude, unrefined feel. When it comes to surviving garments, there isn't a lot of information available about the spacing of the pleats, but I did find that the pleats in the Stoda shirt had the body gathered into a band that were 9mm apart, and that the type D shirts of the Lengberg Castle finds were placed 1.4 centimeters apart. In Imperial, that works out to about 3/8 to around a half an inch apart. Taking a look at the Mary of Hungary smock, the museum says that it has 8 times the fabric compressed into the finished width. Now, I couldn't find out how many pleats there were, so I can't confirm the actual pleat spacing, but when I did a shirt inspired by it, I placed my dots 1/4 inch apart in order to mimic the look. Another thing to consider is that the smaller you make your pleats, the less fabric you will need to use. So based on all this, I would say that it's safe to say that a spacing of around 1/4 inch or 6mm up to a half an inch or 14mm apart is just fine. And as for the spacing between the rows, go for about a half an inch or 14mm apart. Another option is to use iron-on dots. These are sheets of paper that have dots printed onto them at even intervals, and you just lay it across your fabric and you use the heat of the iron to transfer those dots to your fabric.
These dots are designed to be ironed on onto the back of the fabric. Simply just cut a piece of your transfer dots to size and pin it to the back of your fabric. Then take a hot iron. It needs to be as hot as the fabric can take. And since I'm using linen, I set my iron to the hottest. I pin my paper in place and sweep over across the fabric to cover all the dots. Before I move the paper, I make sure that it comes off okay. I can then unpin.
Now that your pleats are marked, you'll want to move on to working your gathering stitches. And of course, there's more than one way to do that as well. So one way is to use what's called the pick up dot method, and the other way is the in the dot, out the dot method. So when gathering, you want to make sure that you cut a piece of thread that is 5 to 6 inches longer than the finished piece that you are working on. Then you'll want to count the amount of rows that you have and thread that many needles with the correct length of thread. Then you will work each row individually until you run out of thread, and then move on to the next row until that one runs out of thread, until you've gone through all the rows. Then you'll gather those up and continuing your gather stitches until you reach the end of the panel. And starching always makes nicer pleats. In the pick up dot method, you're going to go in one side of the dot and out the other side. In doing this, you end up with an uneven basting stitch. Pickup benefits include placing the thread at the back of the work, which is useful if you're doing a pattern darning or picture smocking design. It also creates a shallower pleat, which means it uses less fabric. Drawbacks are it is a little slower and harder to work, and it also can be difficult to maintain the folds, but this can be avoided by being very exacting in your stitches and by using starch. In the dot, out the dot method goes in one dot and out the other. This places the thread in the center of the pleats, which is great for embellishments that remove the gathering threads after completion. It is definitely faster and easier to work. It actually creates a deeper pleat though, and it does take more fabric. However, you can prevent this by either placing your dots closer together if you're marking them yourself, or in the case of using iron-on dots, you can actually just use the space between the dots as an additional dot.
And after you have picked up all your dots, be sure to tie the rows in pair. If you happen to have an odd number of rows, just tie the last 3 together. And when that is done, pin it to the fabric beneath here so it doesn't move. And then gather up the threads. Remember that you are moving the fabric rather than pulling the threads. And when you're done, if you look at the back side, this is the front side.
Moving on to a smocking pleater. A smocking pleater is a mechanical machine that pleats the fabric by pushing it through the grooves of metal rollers onto needles as you turn a knob. Make sure you are using the correct needles for your pleater. Each brand has a size and specific shape to their needles, and if it doesn't match up perfectly, you will have all sorts of trouble. I had gotten some needles that I thought were correct and they weren't. It was a total tragedy. I broke so many needles, and if you've ever had to purchase them before, you know they're not cheap. It was a tragedy. You will want to use a strong but thin thread so that it fits through the needles. I like to use high mark. I have found that it helps to be able to control your fabric as you feed it through the machine. In order to do this, you want to get a dowel with a length that is a bit longer than your fabric, as well as some blue tape. Also, make sure that the diameter is small enough to fit through the holes in the pleater after you have rolled the fabric. My pleater doesn't have a lot of room, so I found that a 1/2-inch diameter dowel works well. Then decide how many rows you want and thread those needles. You can also use the half spaces if you want, but I just tend to eyeball them. Make sure to double your thread and make sure that it is several inches longer than your finished piece, and make sure to use a hefty knot. Line up the end of your fabric on the dowel and tape it down. Make sure it is square and straight, then roll it up and place it behind the wheels of the pleater so that the fabric feeds it from the bottom of the roll. I screwed that up. I totally screwed that up. Place the end of the fabric into the teeth of the pleater and start to feed it by turning the knob. Go slow and keep a little tension on the fabric as you feed it. Make sure it is feeding straight and even. If it does go off kilter, you got to start again. You cannot back up. You will break threads. You will have problems. You'll have a mess. So what you'll want to do is push the fabric through all the way and then cut your threads, rethread your needles, and start your pleating again. Keep turning until you fill up the needles and then gently push the fabric off the needles and onto the threads. And once you have fed the piece through completely, cut the threads and knot them. I also like to divide the thread into pairs by rows and knot them together for extra security. As said previously, if you have an odd number of rows, you could knot the bottom 3 together. Then you'll just push your fabric down to the threads to form your pleats. Arrange, and if you need to stroke them with a pin to make sure they are straight and even, you can do that as well. The next step is to block the pleats in preparation for embellishment or embroidery, but that is coming soon, so keep an eye out here for that video. Now, for more information about the smock shirt, check out this video here. And if you're looking for a little inspiration, then this video walks you through the different layers of the truss route.